أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين سيدنا الممجد بشير المصدق المصطفى الأمجد محمود الأحمد أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين ولعنة الله على الظالمين من الأولين والآخرين أما بعد فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد وفرقانه الحميد وقوله الحق بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الذين يتبعون الرسول النبي الأمي الذي يجدونه مكتوبا عندهم في التوراة والإنجيل يأمرهم بالمعروف وينهاهم عن المنكر ويحل لهم الطيبات ويحرم عليهم الخبائث ويضع عنهم إصرهم وأغلال التي كانت عليهم فالذين آمنوا به وعزروه ونصروه واتبعوا النور الذي أنزل معه أولئك هم المفلحون آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوات على محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على محمد. Awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, my respected brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In our previous discussions looking at our series Decolonizing the Muslim Mind, we have been speaking about the role of the Enlightenment period and the consequential effects of that being the role of secularism. To recap, we stated that the Enlightenment period was a philosophy-led period with the idea of the rationality being supreme and central to the growth of human beings. Religion was playing a very negative trend in the world, whilst humans were moving forward to the ideas of equality amongst black and white, male and female. It was religion that was creating boundaries between these. Whilst it was religion that was creating torture and war, it was rationality that was trying to find a way to create perpetual peace amongst people. And so this clash took place amongst these civilizations. Ultimately, it was rationality that was to win the day, and many people shifted away from the idea of religion because they found religion a stagnating force at that time. Everything that religion was supposed to be, which was liberating, which was reforming, which was revolutionary, religion was not those things. And so people looked outside of religion to be able to find growth in humanity. Now, because rationality ended up playing such a central role, people began to see the role of religion as less important. If we can find out what is rational and we can find out what is moral, then why do we need scripture? Why do we need God? Why do we need any of these churches or these religious institutions to play the role? And so people began to split, and you had those people that were focusing on religion as source for governance of humanity, and you had people that were using rationality as the source of governance for humanity. In order to placate both sets of organizations, you divided into two. You had what was known as the separation of church and state. Church, meaning everything religious. They all had their role. So people could continue to believe in God, could continue to practice, but because there's a separation, now we don't actually need to have these religious institutions governing the way society acts. Rationality, equality should be able to govern the way in which societies act. Now, as a reaction to that, duality was created within the human being. There was a space for God and a space where God does not enter. If you imagine, in the Christian world, you have, for example, a decoupling of church and state. And so, religion and God plays a role primarily on a Sunday morning, where people come from 10 till 12, they sing their hymns, they preach their religious sermons, and then outside of that, for the remaining 166 hours of the week, where is God? Where does God enter into life? Where does God structure the rest of living? Is he there in education? No. Is he there in economy? No. Is he there in business? No. Is he there in politics? No. As a result, we have completely separated God from the rest of our lives. The reality is Islam has also taken on this very same form of living. And this is what we spoke about yesterday, that there is supposed to be balance in everything that we do. If you create imbalance within the oceans, if you create imbalance within the ecology, if you create imbalance within everything, and in society, if you take God away, there will become an imbalance within society. And ultimately, human rationality, human greed will take over and continue to shift God out of the equation in all forms of life. And we highlighted that this takes place within the Muslim community as well. There is duality, there is a dichotomy in the way in which a Muslim tends to live. For example, you will find that within the masjid, within the Husayniyya, within the Imam Bargha, there is one set of living, there is one set of thinking. Whereas outside of that, there is another form of living. This creates duality within the human being. And we highlighted it in many different ways. But we said, for example, the human being will come and they will listen to the muhadara, they will partake in the majlis, and there will be a degree of religiosity within this framework. But if there is duality, if there is a different form of living outside of the Husayniyya, then there is contradiction in the way in which people are living. And we see it many times, and we spoke about this. For example, you will see men, husbands, fathers, they will come to the Husayniyya and they will cry and weep over the martyrdom of Sayyidah Zahra alayhi salam. They will cry and cry. How could Umar ibn al-Khattab come and attack Sayyidah Zahra alayhi salam? What kind of horrendous action is this? But because there's duality in the way in which they live, they will go home and beat their own wife. Then you will find the husband will come on the 10th and 11th of Muharram and cry and cry and cry over someone beating Sayyidah Ruqayya alayhi salam. How is it these dastardly men could attack these little children on the evening of the 11th of Muharram? Yet they will go home and beat their own children. Or for example, a person will come to the Husayniyya and they will wear hijab outside. But as soon as they park the car, the scarf will come on, the chador will come on, they enter into the Husayniyya. There's a different realm. There is God that is here, but God does not exist outside. Where did this duality come from? This duality was never prevalent in Islam as an order in society. This had to come from somewhere external, and then Muslims began to adopt the nature of this duality within their life. This came from the Enlightenment period, which chose rationality, and then it chose the concept of removing God from the centrality of living, and now we decide what is holy, we decide what is sanctified, we decide what is important. This came through secularism, the separation of church and state. By and large, most Muslims and Muslim countries adopt this very same living. If you look at almost all Islamic countries where Muslim majority is, where Muslims used to be or are, you will find that they have completely separated church and state. And as a result, other things have come in to place. Now, this is what we spoke about yesterday. And we stated a hadith from Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi, who says, أعرف الناس وأعرف الناس بالزمان من لم يتعجب من أحداثه. That the one who understands the time in which he or she lives in will not be surprised by it, by events that take place in it. When we see what happens in the world today, as long as we reflect and understand how the world is and why it is the way it is, we would not be surprised when these events take place. And so this evening, we want to move from enlightenment to secularism and now speak about the rise of nationalism and national ideology, and how the national ideology, the way it is today, is by and large following this secular ideal, and as a result has also impacted the Muslim, the way we think, in the way in which we champion the world, or the reality of the hierarchy that we create in our own thinking. As we stated, secularism separates church and state. God has a role, a very limited role, and then the state has a greater role. Think about this for a second. What do you think is the natural consequence of a human being not only shifting the way in which they think and having spaces for one and the other, but now when the state has a greater role to play in decision making than God? According to most international relations scholars and people that look at this particular issue, there are two aspects that come within the nation state secularism creates. The first is the issue of loyalty, and the second is the issue of legislation, creation of law. Now, if you consider the difference between living in quote-unquote an Islamic state, or a state that heralds God at the peak or the apex of it, versus a state that considers separation of church and state, how might your loyalties be shifted, and how might your thinking start to be created and molded by issues of loyalty and legislation? In a state which God is central to, then the loyalty is to the state which upholds God. And also the legislator, the one who decides the laws, are also done in the name of God. Therefore, when one thinks and acts, they are surrounded by an atmosphere which is done for the sake of God. If, however, you live in a secular world, the state has prevalence and preference over church, which means your loyalty and the legislator is now the state. We champion the state and the state's needs above God, and we champion the state as the legislator above God being the legislator, or in our language, the shari', the one who legislates. Think about this now in Britain. Pick the average person in the UK and say that they are Christian. The loyalty is to where? England or Britain. You know, when you see American politics, you will see that every politician in America must say a particular line. Otherwise, they are completely ousted from politics. And that line is, "We make America great again." We do things for the sake of America. We do things for the sake of Britain. We do things for the sake of France, whatever your country is. Immediately, what happens is, over a period of time, the individual starts to think alongside these nationalistic ideas and champions the state and has loyalty to the need of the state as opposed to the loyalty to God. The second is the legislation. The state gets to make the laws. The state decides what is right and what is wrong. In our language, halal and haram. And if the state decides something, then we are obliged to live by the loyalty of the state. The state has the power to become very arbitrary in its thinking. Not just arbitrary, completely schizophrenic in its thinking. That if you were to ask anyone else about their status of logic and consistency, you would say this is complete schizophrenia, but when the state does it, it's okay. For example, Today, to buy and sell alcohol is permissible, isn't it? Here in the state, you can buy and sell alcohol. But if you were to buy another or sell another type of intoxicant, it becomes illegal. For example, if we said marijuana, or for example, if we said cocaine, or if we said heroin, aren't they all intrinsically a type of drug? Aren't they all intrinsically a type of intoxication? Don't they intrinsically all do the same thing? But yet, the state gets to decide what is moral and what is immoral. At 1 minute, the state will say abortion is impermissible. Then the next day will say this, it is permissible. 1 minute the state will say homosexuality is impermissible. The next minute they will say homosexuality is permissible. It is completely schizophrenic in its thinking. And why? Because it is based upon non-God related values. The values of whoever is in charge, the values of the people at that very one moment, they get to decide what is right and what is wrong. We call that democracy. However, the Quran says, and most people know not. وَلَكِنْ أَكْثَرَ النَّاسِ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. Most people, they don't know. When they come together, you see, majority of people do not know. So here, what the nation state does is, number one, separates church and state, making spaces for God and spaces for other. Then the church becomes shrunk, and where the church is even smaller, and so God plays even less of a role. Having removed God out of this, the loyalty is now towards the nation state, and loyalty is less towards God. The legislation comes from the nation state, and the legislation comes less from God. Secularists here are very, very afraid of religion because of this particular purpose. If you look, for example, within France, there is a real fear of religious symbolism. In public space, such as public institutions of education or even corporations, certain overt symbols of religion are disallowed, are prohibited. Why is this? Why is it that I can't wear a cross, or I can't wear the scarf, or I can't wear certain overt religious significations and symbolisms? The reality is, if you believe in God and you believe in a religion properly, your loyalty will come to God first. If the state wants you to perform something wrong, you might respond and say, but my God and my religion and my holy book tells me I can't do this. For example, imagine the state wants you to, I'm picking something at random here, wants you to invade that part of the world. You might say, but this is immoral for me to do. My loyalty is to God. My loyalty is not to the state. The state can tell me to do something, but my morality and my religion and my God tells me no. This is a problem for the secularist, because the secularist wants you to think within the realms entirely of the nation state. Most Muslims have fallen foul to this concept to the extent that they will champion their little nation state above the needs of the ummah and above the needs of humanity. This is the utmost important point, to think about human beings and how Muslims have been divided and been colonized in thinking. Now, I asked you one of the earliest nights, I think the first or second night, and I made a very provocative statement, and I repeat it again tonight. And I purposefully want to be provocative in this question, because if you can understand this question, and depending on how people respond, you will immediately see as to whether you have national loyalties to the ummah, or loyalties towards humanity. Right now, we have Iran and we have Iraq, two separate countries. Now forget the Sunni population, the Kurd population, the Christian and Jew population. I am primarily speaking to a Shia audience, and therefore I'm speaking in accordance with Shia thinking. We have tens of millions of Shia in Iran and Iraq. They are of the same madhab. They are Shia Ithna Ashariya, which means realistically they should be one people. If you ask the majority of Iraqis and Iranis, remove that border between the two of you, unite as a people, because you are the same belief, you are the same madhab, which means you will be stronger together. You could unite, remove the problems that are present amongst people, create a better living society across the two countries into one country, make yourself an ummah. The majority of people would say no. Why? Because national loyalty is more important than the greater need of people, or the greater width of people, or the Muslim ummah. And we stated this when we talked about the issue of Medina, that the Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam, came to a people who were divided and fighting on the basis of identity, religious identity and sectarian identity and tribal identity. For hundreds of years these people fought. Why? Because they saw the other human being as the other. They did not see them as brothers amongst each other. They created arbitrary divides amongst each other and saw each other as enemies. You are from a different tribe, therefore I don't like you. You and me have to be enemies with each other. Yeah, we will create pacts and we will marry into each other in order to create political pacts. But that doesn't mean that they were living as God wanted them to live. Christians, Jews, Muslims, Zoroastrians, separate religions, separate sects. What did Rasulullah come and do? We stated, he drew up a constitution amongst them and said, whoever adheres to this constitution, you are one ummah. You are one people. Most people think Shia ummah, Muslim ummah. No, humanity was what was important in the eyes of Rasulullah. His goal was to get the best out of humanity at large. He did not care whether you were atheist, whether you were Shia, whether you were Sunni, whether you were going to be Christian, whether you were going to be Jew. All of those things came secondary to getting the best out of you. Hence, he was the prophet. Hence, he showed us how to live. Nationalism has made us see each other as enemies of each other. And I dislike you for a very arbitrary reason that someone 100 years ago, 200 years ago created a border between us. And how petty this way of thinking really is. Imagine a border that is created by human beings. It doesn't really exist. Who created the border? Who decided that this should be our part of land and not this part of the land? Who decided it? What makes it real? When you see pictures from space, do you see borders? Do you see human beings dividing themselves and making enemies of each other because of some arbitrary fake lines amongst each other? Imagine I did this here, the stupidity of it. Imagine if I divided the brothers here into half. Said, now these sorts of resources are only yours. These sorts of resources are only yours. These people don't like you and you don't like them. You have to have a different form of living and they have to have a different form of living. What would happen after 50 years, 100 years, 200 years? The children and the children's children would see each other as rivals of each other. Human beings have adopted this way of living, thinking that this is somehow righteous, that this is somehow the way in which God wants us to live. Where did we get this? The Quran said the absolute opposite. The Quran said, إِنَّا خَلَقْنَاكُم مِّن ذَكَرٍ وَأُنثَى. We have made you of man and woman, of different tribes and nations, for the purpose of لِتَعَارَفُوا, to get to know each other, not to find arbitrary means of dividing each other. We as human beings want to find ways of getting on, not separating from each other. And this idea of the ummah being inclusive is the example from Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. Now, where did this idea come from? This idea of separation between people. We have always lived like this. If you think, we used to be nomadic people or pastoral people, where initially groups of people were following the movement of animals and following the different needs of following groups of animals in order to be able to find food. Eventually, groups settled down and became small, tiny towns, villages, tribal systems. Eventually, we had an ethno-religious grouping. Eventually, we moved into the nation state. Today, people look through the eyes of globalization to see the needs of the region, to see the needs of humanity. When we have created these borders amongst each other, as a result of this, we place these boundaries between people that can very easily be changed. 1 minute, we're championing East and West Germany. 1 minute, we're championing Yugoslav identity. The next day, all of this changes, and we now belong to different countries. And all of a sudden, we belong to different ethnocentric groups. Then we travel across the entirety of the world. The majority of the people in this room were not born here. We hail from different parts of the world, and we can see how quickly identity shifts and changes. We can adopt from one another. The ultimate identity within Islam is that of the human identity. And the higher and higher we go in that hierarchy, the more likely we are to be able to bridge the gaps within humanity and bring people together under one roof. The hadith of Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam says that no harm, no harming. La dharar wa la dhirar. No harm and no harming should come. Islam does not occasion harm to people. Now, according to the scholars, there are 4 ways of understanding this particular hadith. The first is that harm must be removed. The second is, wherever necessary, the least amount of harm is given priority to greater amount of harm. And the third, in regards to us, is that wherever necessary, decisions that harm a few individuals are to be given greater priority over the greater needs of society. Wherever the greatest need of society is, Islam seeks to assist. In the globalized world, where our decisions impact the rest of the world, whatever one country does affects the entirety of the rest of the planet. If one country decides to make a nuclear bomb, it impacts the rest of the world. If one country decides they want to create more carbon dioxide, it impacts the rest of the world. If one country decides it wants to overfish the fishery stocks in the world, it impacts the rest of the world. And so the greatest need today is the need of humanity at large. So long as we continue to adopt this notion where I will just champion this one country's needs, it ends up putting at risk the rest of the world, because all I see in front of me is the immediacy of the country that I am promoting. Where did this idea come from? Of putting one group of people ahead of the rest. As we stated, we've always lived in these little groups, and today we live in a globalized world. But people still think along tribalistic mindset, where they want to champion one little tribe, or today what is known as one little country. Now, of course, history is very wide and we don't have time to go into a great amount of information, but one would argue that the current form of living of nation states was created in the middle of the 17th century, what is known as the Westphalian order. That we live today in accordance with what is known as the Westphalian order. Peace treaties amongst European countries. For example, the Westphalian order was created by the peace treaty between Spain and the Dutch. And eventually, through this kind of treaty, different countries were created and different countries gained independence from the Holy Roman Empire. Sweden, Switzerland now bordered themselves off and said, we want to live differently to the rest of you. As a result of this, each country sought to look after its own needs. I have my own amount of resources. You have another amount of resource. How am I going to get your resource? I have two ways. I can either create treaties with you, pacts with you, bonds with you, or eventually I can see you as the enemy and try to take your resource. Now, it's one thing saying that most people don't want to live like that. But when you see empires, and when you see, for example, the British Empire, when you see, for example, the Dutch, when you see the American Empire today, the purpose of these empires is to steal your resource, to take your resource in one way, shape, or form. Why? Because we have not learned to share these resources across the world. The resource belongs to the nation state. I must protect and champion my state to the exclusion of the rest of the world. If you imagine, is this going to create the best form of living? Can human beings really reach their supreme form of living where I see another human, another state as the enemy? Where I see the other state's resources as ones that I need to take? The hadith from Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh says, "Ma ummilat al-buldan bimithli adl." Countries, states, lands cannot have equality or cannot flourish. Ma ummirat al-buldan bimithli adl. States across the world cannot flourish unless and until there is justice amongst them, until there is equity amongst them. When you have countries that have X and countries that have Y that seek to take from one another, you will not have justice across the world. You will not be able to have a world flourishing. And the proof is in the pudding today. Look at the way in which people live in Somalia. Look at the way in which people live in Brazil. Look at the way in which people live in Afghanistan. Is there equality? Is there standards of living across the entirety of the world? There isn't. Why? Because the nation state wishes to champion itself above and beyond the needs of humanity. Now here, what we're saying is that these are obvious challenges to the concepts of nationalism. And I know many people will disagree, and many people will want to champion nationalism and have positive things to say about nationalism, and I respect those. Our series is decolonizing the Muslim mind and asking, why does the Muslim world live the way it lives today? And is it the way in which Rasulullah wanted it to live? And so the very simple question is this: would Rasulullah, will Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam want us to live in the way in which we are living today? Is it most beneficial for humanity to be living in the way in which it is living today? To exclude human beings from each other, to see other human beings primarily as the enemy or as the other. And if we say yes, then we would have to reconcile that with the way in which Rasulullah lived at his time and the way in which he promoted people to live. If we say no, then we have to ask whether we need to be championing the concept of nationalism, or whether this is an outcome, a birth, an outgrowth from secularism, which was an outgrowth from the Enlightenment era. Is there a different way we can be living? Is there a more humane, just way that human beings can learn to live with each other? Is this way of dividing each other by these very arbitrary borders the utmost way of living for humankind? If it is not, it suggests to us that the Muslims should not be championing nationalism, should be championing humanity and human ideals. So long as the Muslim continues to adopt this way of living that is an imposition upon the Muslim mind, the world will not be able to move forward. We have 1.6 billion Muslims, and they live according to the Westphalian order. They live according to the ways of French nationalism created in the 1850s. This cannot be the way Islam wants us to live, and has to be a source of the problems that we have today. And inshallah, tomorrow, when we go further into it, we will start looking at economy, we will start looking at the way in which we adopt free market capitalism, the way in which corporations run our lives, advertising runs our lives, and we continue to adopt these forms of living, again, in opposition to a purer way of Islamic living. Inshallah, I look forward to a discussion afterwards, thinking about nationalism and the way in which Islam might want us to live. Inshallah, you and I can have a healthy debate. We've left 5 minutes at the end in order to have questions, in order to have debate, and we welcome that, inshallah, with the salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So we said that nationalism creates loyalty to the state and not God. We said that nationalism creates loyalty to the national legislature as opposed to God being the legislator, the shari'. We said that nationalism divides human beings arbitrarily and that it creates the human being to see the other as separate from one another. It creates a very isolated, insular view where we see our resources in order to take from other. And we challenge whether nationalism is something that is truly Islamic and whether it is actually the utmost form of living or whether Muslims have adopted something from Europeans. I know that there's going to be good debate, and I'd like to ask for feedback and thoughts on that, and inshallah you'll be able to guide us all. And we open up the floor for the next 5 minutes to be able to discuss some of these ideas. Assalamu alaikum. Please.
I think you would agree with it. Nationalism did start, as you said, when it did. But would you agree that in India, I'm talking about India before the partition, as it was, do you think that nationalism didn't hit us? Because I'm from that part of the world originally. It didn't hit us because we were already colonized by the British. And nationalism, as we see it in the Middle East, Turks blaming we are the Western Arabs and Iranians and everywhere else. But I don't find anything in India or Pakistan or anywhere else who claims I'm an Indian and we have a history and we are Indians. We don't have that kind of passion and national fervor, and certainly we don't have textbooks don't teach us about the ancient Indians and the Hindu religion and everything. Would you agree on that? It's not a question. I think it didn't hit India because we were already colonized and there was no need to bring another disease into India.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I think it's a fantastic point. I agree. And to my mind, my limited knowledge, I imagine that as much as the colonization took place in India, the British really were unable to expunge the vast history, the very beautiful history of India, going back obviously millennia. And as a result of that, it was less seen as nationalism and more just seen as the most beautiful, or one of the most beautiful cultures in the history of humanity. it wasn't seen as national identity. It was seen as a vast culture that actually spread across so much of the Indian subcontinent. I imagine that the British would have done very badly to try to wipe some of that out, and that would have actually caused the Indians to have either revolted a lot earlier or to have completely been put off by whatever was being brought over by the British Empire. So I very much agree with you. Then you mentioned about the Middle East, and I didn't even get a chance to go on to the arbitrary division that the British have done in the Middle East. I mean, we just look at Saudi, Yemen, Bahrain, Kuwait, Dubai, all of it, it's just lines that we know have been created. And the greatest angst in the Muslim world today, of course, is Palestine. And we only have to go back to the Sykes-Picot Agreement to see how what we used to call Syria, or what we used to call the Levant, has just been arbitrarily divided into Syria, into Jordan, and everything else. Now, it's amazing Muslims that believe إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ إِخْوَةً, Muslims are but brothers of each other, now divide each other and see each other as something separate. This is completely alien to Islam. We have adopted it, and this is the real reason why 1.6 billion Muslims are in such a state. I mean, you can't have 1/4 of the world that believes in Quran and Rasulullah, but yet today are the most stagnated people in the world, unless we've adopted something other than our own religion. And this is exactly the issue. But very good point. Thank you very much for the point on India as well. I completely agree.
So nationalism is the idea that you're loyal to your country, to an ideal, to a government. Especially with football now, you see a lot of people, they're very supportive of their teams. Oh, Manchester United is the best, England team's the best. But is this not another form?
Well, firstly, Spurs are the best, but carry on.
Well, I don't watch any football. I don't watch any sport. It blows me out.
I will be glad to give you as much da'wah on the Spurs team, tabligh, as you need. We will sit upstairs, inshallah, after.
We've seen the riots in France, what happening, like a lot of passionate riots and stuff like that. And I don't know, like, I always feel like maybe people hold a lot of faith in the team and stuff like that. It's a very dangerous path to start saying, I identify myself as this group of people. Surely we should do more than to stamp this out, maybe, or maybe we can try and remind people that this. I'm not really making a point here.
No, you're completely correct. It falls very much into the issue of identity, and people do need an identity. But we used to have a very ethno-religious identity. And as we stated, that has been shifted to a national identity. Today, people take identity in many different ways. Their sexuality is their identity, their gender is their identity, their religion, their sect, their nationality, their color. All of these things are different ways of identifying with each other. We're not saying that these aren't positive ways to identify, but when these forms of identity either contradict or impinge negatively on the hierarchy of the identity, then the lower one needs to be separated. We need to take that one away. So the moment I only identify myself as being X, and it conflicts with the need of humanity at large, then I've misunderstood identity altogether. Now, I can break myself down and say I am a British, Shia, Muslim, black, whatever. But the moment all of these impinge upon, say, the need of humanity, as we stated by the hadith of La Darar wa La Dirar, that the fuqaha state, the need of La Darar wa La Dirar is the greater need of society. The moment something impinges on the greater, this is not correct within Islam. So I'm only presenting what the fuqaha say. Now, when we understand this in light of globalization, because we impact each other, immediately I have to think about the needs of the other human being. What people have now done is say, my identity is British and I will go out and riot. My identity is British, I want British sovereignty to be more important than European sovereignty or European regional communitarianism. So what happens is, people will vote for Brexit and think, I need British sovereignty, we need to make our own decisions. As opposed to understanding the intrinsic value of learning to work with the other human being. Learning to be able to say, yeah, I have an opinion, but we collectively can put our needs together for the sake of Europe. And all of this feeds into that concept of identity. And it's very strange that Muslims championing England and championing this and that. People, one of the things we're going to talk about in about 3 lectures, 3 discussions, is going to be the term bread and circuses, which came from the Romans, where basically they created ways to just distract people from the real issues of their time. Bread and circuses. Bread, as long as we kept you semi-full in your stomach, as long as we gave you circuses, we were able to distract you from real things. Exactly the same today. European Championships is no different to bread and circuses of the Holy Roman Empire. We'll talk about that as well, inshallah. Are there any questions or points from the sisters before we conclude? No? Okay. Inshallah, we will continue tomorrow by discussing matters of economy and the way in which you and I can revision the way in which the global economy and corporations have governance over us. Please raise your hands, let's join each other in dua. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to hasten the appearance of Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, to allow us to be alongside him at all times in our life and in our death. If we are to pass away from this world before his coming, to raise us from our graves so that we may partake in the victory of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. We ask you, Ya Allah, there are many people around the world going through such desperate times. Those people in a state of war, poverty, oppression, disease and disaster. Ya Allah, grant them more safety, security and victory for the sake of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. We ask you, Ya Allah, help us to understand our deen better. Help us to understand it and help us to implement it better. Help us in these holy moments of Shahr Ramadan to be able to better our fasts, complete the Quran, reflect upon the Quran and become better human beings, better Muslims inshaAllah, for the sake of Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam. Wassalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May I ask you to recite 3 loud salawat in honor of Imam al-Mahdi, ajjalallahu ta'ala faraj al-sharif.